black dungarees, that type of thing. Sometimes they will tattoo themselves. Then they'll use some earrings which have occult symbols on them that they can buy from mail order houses. A teenage girl testified that at a softball game, she'd overheard Eccles say he'd murdered the children. That, the knife from the lake, and the so-called occult expert seemed to be enough for the jury. Finding both of the teenagers guilty, it sentenced Eccles to death and Baldwin to life in prison. And that, so far as most of the media were concerned, was that. The court had ruled. The three were no longer the alleged killers. They were now convicted murderers. To my knowledge, only one reporter, one newspaper, voiced any doubt. Writing in my paper, the Weekly Arkansas Times, Bob Lancaster, who had attended the trial, observed, "The prosecutors convicted Eccles of checking certain suspicious books out of the public library and copying dark passages full of sound and fury signifying nothing from the likes of William Shakespeare." And that actually was quoted. God help him if he'd ever discovered Poe. And yet, this vague proposition of the murders as an expression of an ignorant boy's conception of the demands of demonology was the state's entire case. That's all we had, and it proved exactly nothing, except that Damien Eccles was being tried, for lack of anything better, for thought crime, with Jason Baldwin being dragged along as an afterthought. By this time, I had two children who had just entered college. My daughter, who majored in philosophy, was into heavy metal. My son, who's now a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, was into Dungeons and Dragons. Like many parents who have gotten involved in this case, I could imagine them on trial. Almost immediately after the convictions, when the case record finally did become public, I drove to West Memphis to see the police files. I wanted to see for myself if there was some real evidence that the media I'd read had missed. There wasn't. I next interviewed Eccles at his new home on Arkansas's death row, and I've been reporting on this case ever since. But I was just a voice in the provincial wilderness. The media heavyweight in this case was HBO, specifically Paradise Lost, an extraordinary documentary made by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky, who had obtained permission from Judge Burnett to film both of the trials. It is ironic that the same judge who questioned jurors in secret, later imposed gag orders on the attorneys, and even later sealed a crucial document in the case, was also the one who allowed the cameras into his courtroom that would later expose it to the world. HBO released Paradise Lost in 1996, 2 years after the trials. That was the same year that the Arkansas Supreme Court affirmed all three convictions. The film had and continues to have a profound impact on viewers. It took no sides, offered no opinion, but in presenting actual trial footage of what occurred, it prompted thousands of viewers to want to know more. Was this what really happened? Was there more than we saw in the film? What has happened since? Viewers were shocked by the murders, by the trials, and by the layers of unanswered questions. A group of artists in Los Angeles created a website, wm3.org, to serve as a hub on the internet for others interested in the case. A man in Denmark started a site that may now be the largest archival record of any criminal proceeding on the internet. Along with every record that has now been discovered, you can see on that site a record of almost every media report on this case, including the commercial appeals. The role of the internet and new media cannot be understated. At least 7 sites, including my own, report regularly on this case, and there are at least 8 active message boards where it is discussed down to the minutest detail. In addition, many artists have come on board, using their celebrity to focus media attention on the case. Metallica contributed its music to Paradise Lost. A Seattle band, the Super Suckers, organized a compilation CD titled Free the West Memphis 3 that included songs by, among others, Tom Waits, Steve Earle, and Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam. When a reporter for the Village Voice asked why these people were doing this, an organizer of the CD explained that he felt an obligation to the kids who listened to the music, especially if their appreciation of their music might someday be used against them in court. In Little Rock, the editor of the weekly Free Press wrote that musicians worried that anyone who bought their records and t-shirts could be considered, quote, a devil worshiper and become a scapegoat in a legal system that fears the unknown vistas of so-called dark music. Dark music. Those are particularly iconic words here in Memphis. As many of you know, there was a time when the music of Elvis Presley, now so very mainstream, was also considered dark. Presley, like many of the blues musicians now lionized on Beale Street, at first outraged Memphis with music that flaunted the big taboos, sex, drugs, and worst of all, subliminal notions of evil. 30 years later, police in West Memphis ransacked the homes of Eccles and Baldwin and hauled out record albums of Metallica, Megadeth, and Slayer, all of which would be used to suggest the boys' murderous states of mind. Almost 10 years ago, Pearl Jam appeared in concert at the Pyramid Arena here in Memphis. At the end of the concert, after 2 encores, Vedder came back on stage. This last song is for a friend I haven't met yet, he announced. He's from West Memphis. I'm going to meet him tomorrow. The band then launched into a biting rendition of The Who's Teenage Wasteland. The next day, Vedder rode in a limousine across the Mississippi River into the Arkansas Delta to the maximum security unit holding Eccles. There is not time enough here tonight to list all of the artists in music, film, and comedy who have risked their professional reputations to publicly support 3 convicted child killers. Many artists have also contributed generously to the support fund established to further investigate and appeal the West Memphis cases. In addition, the list of ordinary people from across the United States, from around the world, who have contributed money online year after year to that fund is enormous, as has been the need for that money. As publicity about the case spread via the entertainment world and the internet, various print and electronic media began reporting on the developing supporter movement. The angle was generally, while police and state officials maintain that the West Memphis 3 are guilty, a new movement has emerged supporting the men in prison. Until recently, most national reporting has continued in that vein, balancing the official convictions against the unofficial voices challenging them. 4 reporters have written books about the case. 3 commercial appeal reporters who covered the investigation and trials, Guy Reel, Mark Parasquia, and Bartholomew Sullivan, wrote the first, Blood of Innocence. My own book, Devil's Knot, came out 2 years later. A Canadian company published an anthology titled The Last Pentacle of the Sun, Writings in Support of the West Memphis 3. And 6 years ago, Eccles' supporters published his own book, Almost Home, about his life and how he experienced the events that sent him to prison. Yet, 3 writers who could have had an enormous influence on this case have kept silent. Stephen King, Dean Koontz, and Anne Rice all have a special relationship to Eccles, Baldwin, and Miss Kelly, in that Eccles cited them when a prosecutor asked him what type of books he read. Earlier in the trial, a police officer, when asked about Eccles' reading habits, replied, Stephen King seems to be horror movies, horror books, and if you're asking if I felt that was strange, yes sir, I did. When my book came out, I sent a copy of it to King, Koontz, and Rice, explaining that 3 men had been pilloried in part for having read their works. But as of yet, apparently, none has seen the need to speak out. For the most part, newspapers have joined in their silence. News is what's happening now. That's why they call it news. And for most newspapers, the West Memphis case had become history. Once the trials were over, the West Memphis Evening Times reported only on the men's occasional appeals, the resignation of the West Memphis detective who led the murder investigation, and the conviction